Luma and the floating city of ancient bridges. Luma, the gentle grey-white fox, rose along a winding path of mist that lifted from the valley like a stair taught by sky, her paws touching each step as though the clouds themselves had shaped them for her passage, and soon she stood before the first arch of a city hovering above the world, an ancient marvel where spans of stone stretched across open air and terraces of marble leaned into light as if resting on the breath of wind, the whole place glowing with lanterns that swayed like small moons moored to the air. She moved slowly, her fur brushing railings carved with signs that had been softened by ages of drifting breeze, and she felt the place give and receive like an instrument tuned to kindness, carrying the memory of countless beings who had wandered these aerial roads before her. From a side passage stepped a figure robed in linen the color of parchment, bowing with simple dignity, their voice a bell touched by air as they welcomed her to the bridges of remembrance, explaining that this city did not rest upon earth nor upon cloud alone but upon a cord, each stone bound to the next by songs the wind knows by heart, and that every traveler who arrives becomes part of the ongoing page the city writes upon sky. They guided her along a suspended walk paved in smooth tiles where moss glimmered faintly as though it drank thin starlight, and as Luma padded forward she noticed pocket gardens anchored to arches, bowls of soil holding venerable trees whose roots dangled into the vastness, branches reaching across the open to touch and braid a canopy of leaves that shimmered silver and green. The guide told her that these trees were carried here on ancient winds long before the first tower was coaxed from stone, and that they agreed to remain and tutor the masons in the curves that please air, so walls were never persuaded to be straight when a gentle bend would make them breathe better. They reached a plaza floating between four arches where fountains spilled water that did not fall but blossomed into globes, each sphere hovering and reflecting lantern flame into soft constellations, and children of the city played by tapping the globes so ripples of light rolled outward and then thinned into mist. Luma touched one sphere with the tip of her paw and watched it swell with a glow that held her reflection like a thought in a drop, and she felt the calm weight of discovery, the kind that asks nothing other than presence. Another figure approached, a musician bearing a long instrument shaped from dark wood polished to a low sheen, its strings drawn with silver thread, and the musician bowed and walked beside them, sending notes into the air that drifted ahead like petals and returned as softened echoes, as if the bridges themselves hummed in agreement. They passed towers with spiral windows cut to let wind pass freely through chambers where streamers and woven cloth swayed with slow grace, and each building seemed less constructed than conversed into being, a meeting of stone and air instead of a contest. The scent of incense arrived from a nearby sanctuary whose roof curved outward like a resting bird. Inside, attendants sat with palms pressed and eyes half closed, their breathing matched to the rhythm of the city's sway, and a single bell rang, low and round, sending a soothing ring across the terraces that found a nesting place in Luma's chest. Beyond the sanctuary opened a market held upon interlaced platforms bound by braided vine and marble slats, where stalls offered fruits with tender luminescence, breads shaped as spirals that steamed with anise and clove, pottery painted with patterns of cloud and wing, spices sealed in glass that caught lantern fire and turned it to amber. The citizens greeted her with nods and slow words. No one hurried, each gesture carrying the weight of welcome. Luma tasted a slice of pear colored like dawn, cool and yielding, and the flavor traveled through her with the patient warmth of morning tea. Beneath the platforms hung nets woven from strands of gold grass to catch the blossoms that drifted down from sky gardens above, and each blossom released a breath of perfume when touched, layering the air with jasmine, cedar smoke, and a clean mineral scent like rain on stone. The guide explained that the city is a vessel and a harbor both, receiving memory and sending remembrance, that every arch holds a softened echo of feet and paws and wings, and that the blossoms catch what words forget to say and return it as fragrance to those who will listen by breathing. They climbed a grand stair carved inside a pillar rising directly from cloud, and at the top Luma found gardens riding separate rafts tethered by bridges of reed and marble, the plots blooming with lavender beside silver grasses, lilies whose petals held their own dim light, vines heavy with lantern-shaped flowers that seemed to hum in rhythm with air. At the center of one garden, a sundial did not mark hours but directions of breath. Inhale toward the east where pale light gathers, exhale toward the west where day lengthens into rest, a stillness upward, a stillness downward, and Luma understood without instruction that this measure was the city's metronome. The musician brushed a chord and the sundial's surface shivered as if to agree. They entered a library built inside a suspended dome of glass and stone, its shelves curving like the spiral of a shell, filled with books, scrolls, and clay tablets, each inscribed with languages old as rivers, and when Luma passed her gaze across them, meanings rose into her as sensation more than sentence, rain at dusk on cedar, bells across water, tea steam in early light, cool marble beneath a paw. A librarian bowed and offered a page that glowed with script. When she read, she did not see letters but tasted smoke from pinewood, felt linen under sun-dried hands, and heard footsteps along an echoing corridor that reminded her of distant summers. Outside, a colonnade opened to a ring of chimes made of jade and bronze, their tones weaving with the musician's line and carrying across bridges to return as softened threads of sound, a lullaby sung by stone and air together. Luma followed her guides over an arch where lanterns had been set in long rows, each flame gifted by a traveler who once walked here, a flame that remembers their breath and offers its glow to those who come after. She bowed as she passed, sensing a patient lineage in every small light. They paused at a balcony where the world below stretched into mist and stars, and the guide spread a cloth woven from cloud fiber upon the marble. Together they shared bread, fruit, and tea steeped with terrace herbs, and the musician let the melody thin to a thread that the wind carried and returned. Far above, suspended walkways crossed like calligraphy, and between their strokes perched sculptures of animals, birds, and thoughtful spirits leaning outward as though listening to the world and to Luma as well, offering silent company, that steadied her breathing. Discovery here, she realized, was less the finding of the unfamiliar and more the slow unveiling of what had been waiting with patience. The city opened itself the way a flower opens at night, not for spectacle but for life. They continued toward a district of artisans where a bell founder tended bronze cooled in moonlit air, shaping tongues for bells that were tuned to the pace of walking. He invited Luma to touch a finished bell, and it answered with a sound that swelled and softened like the sea passing under a pier. Nearby, a paper maker lifted sheets from a vat where water carried fibers that gleamed like threads of dawn. She placed the sheets on felt and pressed them with a wooden board, and when the board rose the paper held a faint watermark of a bridge, a promise that words set upon it would cross into calm. At the glider quay, a teacher showed students how to spread fabric wings for drift lessons in the eddies between towers. They practiced not launching but listening for the moment when air offers itself, and Luma watched one student lift from a parapet and sail a slow arc before stepping back to stone as if nothing dramatic had occurred. Only a conversation continued. In a hall of mirrors that did not flatter, she saw reflections layered with memories of previous visitors, a fox, a heron, a traveler with a staff, each image leaving a faint trace like pollen on glass. The guide said the hall collects bearings rather than faces, the way a compass collects north. They crossed into a quarter where water ran along channels carved into the stone, not as rivers but as lines for the hand, and citizens trailed their fingers as they walked so the city could read their mood through small disturbances. The channels answered with glitters and tiny rings that traveled outward under lanterns. Past the water lines, a terrace opened to an aviary without cages where wind itself kept company with birds. Swallows looped through arches and doves drowsed on ledges, and a single heron stood like a calligrapher punctuating the sky with stillness, and Luma paused long enough to feel her heartbeat pick up the gentle measure of wings. A gardener arrived carrying a tray of seedlings grown from seeds collected on distant coasts. She set the tray on a balustrade and the seedlings tilted their leaves toward a flow of air Luma could not see but could sense in the way her whiskers learned a new angle. They passed under a bridge where a wind harp had been strung from span to span, and the strands sang whenever a draught wandered through, tones layering and drifting away until only the memory of hearing remained, which felt nearly the same as the hearing itself. The guide brought Luma to the Temple of Steps, a long shallow staircase where each riser bore a phrase carved down to a smoothness that could be felt with pause. Travelers moved slowly, reading with their souls, and the phrases formed a poem about arriving into breath and leaving with gratitude, and though Luma did not recite a single line, she felt as if she had. In a modest court, artisans in soft shoes worked clay into bowls whose rims undulated like distant hills. One potter pressed a thumbprint onto the base of a finished bowl and said the city prefers to remember hands with the same tenderness it remembers arches, and Luma understood that small marks are a language of belonging. A staircase of cedar led to sleeping terraces where travelers could rest for a handful of breaths. Attendants offered cushions filled with reed down and small cups of barley tea, and a brazier gave off a cinnamon warmth, and for a moment Luma allowed her eyes to dim and her ears to receive the slow chorus of chimes and footsteps and faraway wings. When she rose, they walked toward a platform where attendants kept a simple chart of currents scrawled upon slate. Pale lines traced the gentle drift from garden to garden, and an amber loop marked an evening meander, and the guide placed a paw beside hers, so they traced a path together while the platform turned with patient grace. They visited the scriptorium of breath where scribes wrote with brushes dipped in mineral pigment that smelled faintly of slate. Instead of letters, the brushes made strokes that matched inhalation and exhalation, slim and long, full and easing, and readers understood the texts with their lungs rather than their eyes, and Luma felt a page settle into her chest as a new rhythm rather than an instruction. In a shaded court, a sculptor sanded marble until it felt like water held in a bowl. He invited Luma to rest a paw upon the stone, and the coolness rose like a kind fog through her leg, easing every small effort she did not realize she carried. A passage opened to niches where bowls of polished stones rested, river smooth and warm from day, and a notice invited travelers to take one and place it somewhere in the city as a promise to return, and Luma chose a pebble with a white thread through gray and set it into a seam beside a baluster where her paw could find it again. As dusk thickened to velvet, attendants moved along the spans to light lamps in order, and from each lamp a small moth rose and circled once as if reading the flame before drifting toward the gardens. The air tasted of orange peel and tea, and tethers hummed softly as the rafts adjusted to evening's gentler breeze. They descended by ramp to an underbridge where a reflecting basin held water so still the city could see its own lanterns like a second sky. The guide asked Luma to lean and exhale, and her breath sent rings across the surface, and each ring lifted a lamp's image for a heartbeat, so the light seemed to nod in thanks. From there they made their way to the hall of earrings where long strands of shells and hammered brass hung from beams. When the wind moved, the strands turned and spoke in soft taps and murmurs, and an elder sitting on a stool explained that this was the sound of agreements, small bells consenting to share space without needing to be first. On a small terrace a calligrapher painted with water onto hot stone, so the strokes flashed dark and then faded, a script written for the moment alone. She smiled at Luma and said that some messages prefer to accomplish their work by vanishing. They stopped at a kiosk where a map-maker with ink-stained fingers sold charts of the sky as it appears beneath the bridges, constellations drawn not above but below, a mirror atlas to guide gliders home. Luma traced the line of a constellation shaped like a curled fox, and felt a tender recognition pass through her. Later they reached the Garden of Steady Leaves, a platform planted with low trees that do not tremble even when wind shifts. Beneath them benches of sandstone kept a slow warmth, and lanterns lowered on cords until they hung at the level of faces, so conversations could meet light without strain, and an herbalist poured tea scented with lemongrass and grain and offered a sliver of candied ginger that melted into ease. The musician changed to a softer instrument, a reed flute wrapped in indigo cloth, and the notes moved like the shadow of swallows, touching corners of stone and lifting again. And the guide told a story about the first masons who asked the wind to critique their plans, who rebuilt an arch 3 times until it sang instead of resisting. They visited a room of sand where a monk drew river lines with a bamboo rake and then smoothed them away with the back of the tool, his movements even and unforced. He invited Luma to make a single line, and as she did the sand shone faintly as if relieved to be touched kindly. On the longest span a troop of lantern-bearers moved in measured steps, each holding a globe whose wick slept low. In their wake a fragrance of beeswax and cedar traveled, and citizens paused along parapets to let their chest find the same unhurried cadence. At the aviary gate a keeper opened a ledger that recorded migrations through the city, not of birds alone but of seeds, scents, and songs. She entered Luma's name with a small brush and pressed a leaf beside the ink so that the page carried both sign and breath. In the cupola of memory, an attendant kept shelves of objects found by breezes, a button smooth with years, a glass bead, a folded scrap of music, a rusted key that opened nothing and yet opened a smile. Visitors could borrow an object for a lap of the bridges and return it with a line in a journal, and Luma borrowed a thin coin stamped with a fox and later wrote simply, "I listened and the city replied." They ate slices of steamed pear drizzled with honey and sprinkled with sesame, a dessert offered in porcelain cups that warmed the pores. The musician tuned one string with a soft pinch, and the notes settled into everything around them as if it had been expected. At last they returned to the balcony where they had first shared tea, and the guide produced a cloth bundle tied with grey ribbon. Inside rested a small wind chime of stone and twine, light enough to carry yet tuned to the bridges, and she said it would sing whenever Luma's breath matched the city's measure, which is to say whenever she remembered to be kind to herself. The hour grew late in the way that makes edges of towers soften, and attendants moved like moths along the parapets adjusting wicks and checking tethers. The city swayed with the steadiness of a cradle and the marble gave back a low warmth gathered during day, and Luma felt her pores loosen as if stones had learned the art of massage. The guides led her to the stair of farewells, which descended in a gentle curve to the path of mist, and there they bowed with hands on heart and eyes bright as lamp oil, and the musician offered a last chord that seemed to fold the entire night into a single ribbon. Luma pressed her paw to the stone and felt all that she had walked past upward like fragrance, and she understood that she would return, not by plan but by the tidal motion of memory. She began her descent through the mist, carrying the chime and the taste of pear and the cool of marble and the melody that would not leave, and behind her the city continued to breathe over the world like a suspended garden that had decided to share its calm with anyone willing to look up and linger.